Hi everyone, welcome to Bita's ongoing seminar series. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Morgan Tier. For those that don't know Morgan, he is now the manager of the Behavioural Economics and Research team in the Queensland State Government, or BERT, if you haven't heard of it. It's not just QUT and the Best Centre and the Bita Centre that has a license on gaudy acronyms. But to give you a little bit, just a quick intro on Morgan. A UQ graduate in Psych, has had a research fellow position at the London School of Economics, was for a very long time, when I first met him, working at Behaviour Works at Monash in Melbourne. So definitely has the pedigree in behavioural science, and he's here today to talk to us, or when we talked about giving a presentation, I know we get a lot of purely research academic stuff here, but with such an incredible life experience in behavioural economics, and I don't want to sound like a MasterChef contestant, but such an amazing journey to come through behavioural science. I think he's got a really interesting stuff to talk to and to offer the group. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Morgan.
Thank you, Steve. I think that introduction really elevates the dish. So yeah, when Steve and I spoke, we thought about, well, what sort of thing can we talk about that would be interesting for this audience? And one of the things that I always really liked, especially when I was deep in my PhD, was when people came and gave something that was a little bit light, that you can engage in without having to think really hard about theory and data and methodology, but that kind of at the same time gave a kind of wide view or a big picture. So when I was really deep in the PhD, it was fun to come out and take this wide view. So that's kind of how I structured this presentation today. And what I thought that wide picture could be about is all the different kinds of flavors of behavioral science and how it's sort of, what the goals are in different contexts, what the pressures are in different contexts, and how that shapes how we do, and so that it looks slightly different. I won't talk a lot about behavioral science in academia because I think you're all quite well versed in that, but I will be kind of referring to that. So if you do have any questions, please by all means put your hand up, and that goes for people in the Zoom as well. I was about to say Teams, but it's nice to be back in Zoom. Teams is horrible. So, so let's kick on. I'll just use this mouse. I've lost it now, sorry. There it is. Yep, that's shit. Good to go. Lovely. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. This land being the land of the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples. This is a place of sharing stories and passing on information across generations, and it's so great to see that the site of QUT is upholding that long history of sharing knowledge. So I wanted to acknowledge that. A little bit about our team. So we're called BERT, that's the Behavioural Economics and Research team. We've just found out that there might actually be another BERT somewhere else in Queensland Government. So we're about to go on a really big branding exercise. So it's good to know that now, I guess. But we were officially born on, what have we got there, 31st of July last year. We are kind of modelling the situation that's been set up quite successfully in Victorian, New South Wales and federal governments, where there's a behavioural insights unit that sits centrally in government so that it can coordinate and uplift behavioural insights across all of government activities. That's the team at the moment. So we've got Michelle Wellington, who is our Assistant Director General. Her job is really to go and push BERT throughout all of government. She operates at quite a senior level, so she's able to connect, where there are similar priorities and similar efforts across government, and sort of insert us into that conversation so that we can start to have impact. Kathy Benson is our director. Her role is to, I guess, kind of represent us within the greater DPC. So very quickly, we work quite closely with different policy teams within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Some of those things are coming down from the Premier directly. Other things are being worked up by the policy teams, but it's her job to kind of coordinate what they're working on and then inserting us into that. I'm the manager of the team. I'm kind of responsible for the function, how we actually take these requests and how we can generate research products that address those and allow us to make sure that people and their behaviour are well understood before anything goes too far in terms of policy or service delivery. Liz is our principal advisor. She has a comms background, so a lot of behavioural insight stuff can be applied to things like communications, ad campaigns, that sort of thing. And then we also have Bryn, who is our principal data analyst, who handles a lot of our quantitative research. He's got a background in pure economics. So he's been quite a good addition to the team. That's just to give you a bit of an insight about, well, we're not all trained in behavioural economics or behavioural science. Michelle's a recent grad of the grad dip program here. Liz is currently undertaking it, but Kathy hasn't worked in what you might call pure behaviour science. Kathy comes from a marketing background, and Liz, I said, comes from that comms background. So there's lots of different skill sets and backgrounds and people that make up, I will say, a successful behavioural insights team. We're working on that at the moment because we're quite new. But I think the broader point is there's no sort of mold that you need to fit in order to work in these sorts of teams. A little bit about me. And so this presentation is kind of an identity crisis spanning over about 10 years now. I might walk you through a bit of my journey. So I started out at the University of Queensland and I did my undergrad there in psychological science. I didn't know what else to do, and at the time it was very easy to do a PhD. So I stayed around and did a PhD. I was really enamored with violent video games. I thought there was a lot of stuff out there that was being said about them that I didn't think held up to scientific rigor. So I spent 3.5, 4 years working on that. That was purely a personal interest in the topic. I didn't know about any jobs that I would get from that. It was maybe sort of the purest, most navel-gazy academic research you could do. After that, I went to the London School of Economics, hired because the guy that hired me really liked video games. So it all kind of worked out, but not to work on video games. At the London School of Economics, I was doing a social psychological approach to organisational safety culture, particularly in air traffic control and coordination across various different airspaces in Europe. So I really kind of applied a nice application of social psychology to something a little bit less navel-gazy. So we published this in 2020 about how different countries have different national cultures. One thing that varies across national cultures is the extent to which workers are comfortable interacting with their managers outside of work contexts. And that's something that also predicts the safety culture of an organisation. At that point, so that was my postdoc, still pretty keen on academia, but not really sure of the direction to take. I was in the UK and I was trying to figure out what the next step was. Logically, it made sense to be applying for lectureship positions. I interviewed for a couple, I got an offer at one. It's not a place you've ever heard of. But in the end, I didn't take it because I kind of got this window into how research doesn't have to be confined to the ivory tower. You can be doing some really cool stuff that's a bit more applied, it's a bit more out there and a bit more relevant than violent video game research. So this really great opportunity came up at Behaviour Works Australia, which, if you're not familiar with, is a behaviour change research consultancy based out of Monash University. And so it really kind of satisfied this want to keep, one foot in academia, but also not be doing the traditional academic work. Being able to get out there and every project you work on is something that is really applied. And I think BEST kind of sits quite closely to this sort of model as well. Let me know if you disagree. And so we kind of, the work we're doing there, we kind of stepped away from psychology. It's all about like effects, and there's a bit of theory development, but we were kind of stepping away from that. And it was actually more about how do you get stuff done? How do you, what's sort of the meta stuff that you need to be thinking about if you want to work in an applied context? So one of the things, actually I presented this at BEST 2022, is work on how do you scale up successful behavioural interventions. The typical pipeline is you pilot a behavioural intervention, it shows some measure of success, and then every politician wants to take it to scale. So how do you do that? And long story short, that's something that needs to happen right at the start. So if we're designing these interventions to be scalable from the outset, that's the best approach. But you can see that's different from violent video games cause aggression. And then, so after that, I've ended up at Queensland Government. They were setting up the behavioural economics and research team. They brought a bunch of us on last year, and it's been really awesome since. So now I wanted to take a moment just to sort of talk you through at least how I kind of think about the different sorts of contexts. This is not evidence-based. There's no theory. I could have looked up definitions, but I didn't. This is just my gut feel. So if you would put things differently, again, by all means, pop your hand up. So in academia, and this is going to be an oversimplification, I know that. So the goal is about advancing knowledge and understanding. It's often driven by curiosity and theoretical development. Academics strive to contribute to theoretical frameworks, expand scientific understanding, and explore novel ideas. That's the goal. Knowledge in this context is rigorous with a strong emphasis on validity, reliability, and generalizability. It's theory-driven, and there's a heavy reliance on peer review processes to validate findings. Does that sound okay so far? Yeah. Okay. And then in terms of implementation, findings are primarily disseminated through academic journals, conferences, and books. It's not always the case that the application of research findings is the primary focus of the work, though sometimes it is. But academic work can influence policy and practice indirectly through this diffusion of knowledge. So that's kind of how I would characterize academia and how knowledge is implemented, generated and implemented. That's my gut feel. In government, the goal is to improve policy and inform policy and improve public service delivery. Research in this context is often about solving particular societal problems, such as reducing crime rates, enhancing public health, or improving educational outcomes, for example. So it takes a kind of issues focus, and it's about how can we change that. So knowledge here is heavily applied. There are a lot of pilot programs, field experiments, and evaluation studies, though not as much as you would think. And these are about directly testing knowledge and interventions in real-world settings. There's a strong emphasis on practicality, so things that are both pragmatic and timely, and that have policy relevance. But sometimes there's a risk of oversimplifying the knowledge to meet the target audience. And then in terms of implementation, research in this context is directly implemented into policy decisions, program designs, and legislative actions. Success of research is measured by its impact on policy effectiveness and public welfare rather than scholarly recognition. So to a degree, government doesn't care that you got published in Nature. They want to know either how many dollars you've saved or how many people you've elevated above the poverty line, that sort of thing. But we've also got, it doesn't have to be one or the other. And in fact, I think probably a mix of these two things is the best outcome. So pracademia, the mix of practice and academia, has a slightly different goal. To me, it's about integrating academic insights with practical applications and facilitating the flow of information and methodologies between academic and practical fields. So that improves the impact and relevance of both. To me, there's this, it's primarily about knowledge translation, generating high quality knowledge and making sure it's inserted as effortlessly or frictionlessly as possible into application. In terms of knowledge, there's a strong emphasis on collaborative research involving stakeholders from various sectors, which does include academia, but also industry and government. And the collaborative approach ensures that research is both comprehensive and directly applicable to the challenges people are working on. This is something that stood out to me quite strongly in the last sort of 4 to 5 years. And then in terms of implementation, research findings are implemented in ways that directly influence practices, policies, and decision-making processes. And I guess implemented in a way that's kind of streamlined. So that's how I would kind of conceptualize those three things. And then to summarize pracademia, I think, and this is just my feeling, that it's about academically rigorous approaches to knowledge translation and implementation to navigate real-world complexity. How does that sit with people? It's an okay definition. Cool. Would anyone here consider themselves a pracademic? Yeah. I'd guess there'd be a few people here.
Question. So how do you deal, what is needed, for example, to deal with some of the issues, for example, inpatients?
Like in hospital?
No, inpatient, that you need to have a quick response, which you see often in government, government policies. They want to have a quick feedback. Is it useful or not? What is needed for? Do you think that it's kind of behavioral insights units, they are really contributing to have the time to derive this knowledge transition into policy? Because I think that's a big problem. It's kind of impatient. Yeah, I want to decide now.
Yeah.
And as soon as possible.
People
Tomorrow is too late.
Yeah.
And again, it's kind of an institutional structure like behavior insight unit. Is that enough? What else do we need to progress in that kind of space?
This is probably our biggest challenge at the moment. We're on election timelines at the moment, and because we've got, normally even in the lead up to a normal election, there would be a pipeline of policy stuff that would be either implementable, announceable. That pipeline would already be there. But with a new premier, a lot of that has started from scratch. Yeah. And so we're operating in a situation at the moment that is described to me as someone new to government as even more atypical than usual. So the timing thing has been a real challenge for our team. If we were going to deliver best practice research insights, there'd be no value in our team in the current context. We're hoping there's a lot more value post-election. And so what we're having to do is be really effective at understanding what people are doing already, and without changing their process too much, slotting in with something that we think is useful. So that might be an issues brief where we've done a very rapid version of a rapid review protocol. That might be one thing we do. Another thing is taking existing data that has been collected, not for the purposes of behavioural analysis, but then providing a secondary behavioural analysis on those data. Those are things that we can deliver, tomorrow or yesterday. But we're also trying to set up projects that are on much longer timescales. So the goal is, about 4 or 5 projects that are operating on like a 6 to 12 month timeline, as well as this other work, which we can do quite quickly. So to answer your question, I don't think I have answered your question, but it's something we're working on, I guess, is maybe the answer. Yeah. So we've gone through, I guess, like an academic, a practice, and a pracademic sort of framing. And I use government as practice, but there's lots of different types of practice. I'm just focusing on government because that's my world at the moment. But I wanted to take you through, I guess, how a pracademic approach is maybe beneficial. And to do that, I wanted to start with, well, what's kind of a typical behaviour science case study where we're not taking a pracademic lens, where we're taking that very government BI unit bread and butter approach. So this is something that we did last year. The problem was there's a number of, well, there's a register of people who are applying for social housing. One thing that happens is when their application is successful, they're contacted. About 1 in 3 of those applications can't accept the offer because their contact details are out of date. This is potentially something that's really impactful because if that letter is the difference between you having a roof over your head or not, that's pretty major. So one of the things we did was to work with the Department of Housing to understand what that process looked like and whether there was any kind of opportunity for a behavioural insights approach to help correct that. A bunch of things came up in that sort of early discovery phase. Was one, applicants didn't really understand the importance of updating their contact details. Another was that it was difficult for them to update their details. It was a bit sludgy, there was a bunch of friction. And then the third was they were forgetting to do it. They understood, for those who did understand the importance, they were sometimes forgetting to find the time to do it. And if it's something that that has a bit of friction in it, if you can't do it right as you remember, you're going to put it off and then you're going to forget about it. So these were some of the main barriers that were uncovered. Basically what we did, this is behavioural insights, bread and butter. We took the letter that they were receiving, once they entered their details into the system, the letter that they got to confirm that had been received and was all good, we changed a bunch. And we changed it to try and address some of those barriers before. So we did things like, make the call to action really salient. You need to keep your contact details current to stay on the housing register. That's the second line in this letter. We personalized it. We framed, the call to action in terms of loss aversion. If you don't do this, you might not get a house. Provided much simpler ways of actually keeping the details up to date, and then simplified the ask of them on that second page. And this is something that we know works. Compared to the original business as usual letter, we saw improvements in all of our measures of success. People had better understanding. They understood the key call to action better. More people intended to update their details than those who received the control letter. And those who were mistaking the purpose of the letter, that number reduced. So this is a very simple, we've got one straightforward behaviour. We know that if we make things easy, attractive, social and timely, that it'll probably result in more people doing it. That's a very typical practice application of behaviour science, I would say. Now I wanted to go through some things that I think are kind of the way that I see behaviour science going in a practice context, that are about taking rigorous methodology and making sure that that knowledge translation occurs in practice. One of these things we're working on at the moment is the big problem of tiny fire ants. I think there's been a pretty major uptick. I don't know if it's just because I've started working on this, but I've started seeing media about fire ants everywhere. It's been a problem for 20 years in southeast Queensland, but if they don't eradicate them in the next few years, then all bets are off. Australia just has fire ants now. So there's a really big push at the moment to solve this problem. And one of the key areas that they're having trouble working with is getting access to properties to inspect and treat fire ants. Now, under the Biosecurity Act, they have a legal mandate to enter properties, but they request access because it's just better for everyone if there's not people randomly showing up and forcing their way onto your property. But people still refuse. And sometimes it's for things like, I've got dogs, I'm not home that day, can we schedule it to next week and I'll make sure the dogs are inside? All the way to, sovereign citizens that have caches of guns under bunkers and that sort of thing. So there's a spectrum of refusers in this space. It's only about 400 people a year that are refusing access out of all of southeast Queensland. But the problem with that sort of non-compliance is the effect of not complying has a huge impact. The compliance is through the roof. It's like 99%. That's more than people wearing seatbelts. But the problem is, or the difference is, if you don't wear your seatbelt, that does not then mean you're going to have an accident and end up in a fatal crash. But if you don't treat fire ants and you're the only person on your street who hasn't treated, then they may as well have not treated the entire street. The direct line between non-compliance and negative outcomes is much stronger for fire ants than it is for not wearing a seatbelt. So it's a really important part of the overall eradication strategy. And so what we're doing is, you could sort of say, look, it's very simply one behaviour. Property owners need to allow treatment crews onto their property. And you can break that down, but essentially that would be one behaviour. But what we're finding is it's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more reasons for refusal. And so if you segment people according to that, there's a lot of different types of people that are refusing for lots of different reasons. There are also behaviours happening at the property owner level, but a lot of things that can happen at the level of the fire ants program. It's a federally funded program that's administered through Queensland state government. There's a lot of things they're doing wrong that they could fix up as well. So, and even within the fire ants program, there's stuff happening at an executive level, all the way down to the crews on the ground that are doing things in suboptimal ways. So what we're sort of starting to seeing is there's actually this really complex system of multiple different actors, multiple different audiences, and behaviours associated with all of them that are contributing to this problem. So it's not a simple one-to-one, if we target this audience and this behaviour with a single intervention, we'll solve the problem. It's much bigger than that. So what we started doing was, I guess a lot of that insight started coming out through some of the early work that we did. We went out to the National Fire Ants Program, which is down in sunny Barambin, near Logan. And we worked with a bunch of people from all across the fire ants program to understand what they think their service delivery looks like. What do they think it looks like when a crew goes out to a property and there's a refusal? The first really interesting thing was all those people who are working on this problem have never been in the same room together. So that was really good to get them all together thinking about the same thing as a collective. The second thing is we extracted a full overview. We call it a service blueprint of all the contact points they have with people, who's contacting them, what's happening, what are the opportunities for a successful resolution, and where are the opportunities, or where are the pain points. But that's their perspective, right? And what we know is that's never the whole perspective. So the next point we did was we actually got in touch with 5 different refusers, we call them. It's not a great term, but people who deny property access doesn't roll off the tongue as well. And we sat down with them and we did this journey mapping approach. So we sat with them for 2 hours and we said, what was your first point of contact with the fire ants program? And they'll say, oh, they came to my gate and I wasn't happy about it. And we say, was that the first time you contacted them? Or there was contact? And they'll be like, oh no, I guess I got a message that they were coming. We'll say, was that the first time there was contact? And they'll be like, oh no, I got a letter initially. And so what we're doing is sitting down. I really love this technique. I've never done it before. But what we're doing is we're taking our kind of we're creating a shared mental model of the whole experience and mapping it out on paper in front of them. So we can go down a rabbit hole and draw it out and sort of talk about who is involved at what point and what happened and how it made them feel. And then we can come back to it. And because it's on the table, they can immediately, we both know what we're talking about. It's just a really cool technique, but it's really helpful for capturing this kind of system level complexity.
So how much do you rely on knowledge that is already there, but it's not obvious? For example, how much do you talk to the postal office who daily delivers mails? Because they're the closest one in contact with.
Yeah, we had
property.
We had one guy whose first letter was nailed to a fence, not even near his mailbox. So we don't speak to things like the post office, but we do ask them about things like that. Like, you know, if we're hearing that there is that first point of contact in the program, but the customer never received that, then pain point for sure. So what we're able to do is take these, so this is each participant's journey map. We're able to kind of collate them and through a kind of qualitative analysis find where there's similarities and where we can condense into more manageable maps. We can then, so this is the service blueprint. That's an amalgamated customer journey map. We can then sort of put them on top of one another, not literally, but more or less put them on top of each other and see where they map up, where that's the same, but then where they diverge. And we can start to say what we've done is kind of highlighted in yellow. I don't know if you can see that, but we've sort of said, look, these are really great points that you can start thinking about addressing. And so what we've done is we've taken all this complexity, where there are multiple actors, multiple audiences, multiple barriers and drivers, and we've been able to reduce it into something that's a little bit more manageable, especially for the fire ants team. So I think that's an example. I don't think that's the best example of how like a pracademic approach can be applied to behavioural insights, but it's the best that we've got going at the moment. But I think it's a good example of taking that kind of rigorous approach and understanding complexity in the real world. I think there's a few things coming up that is a bit more about where I kind of see behavioural science going from a government application perspective. And one is about, one is this kind of, there's a lot of criticisms of that bread and butter behavioural insights approach, or let's call them nudges. One is it focuses on individuals as the source and solution to the problem. One, it neglects systems thinking and complexity. At least in government, there's an over-reliance on black box thinking, not really understanding that something does change or impact something, but not why. And there's an over-reliance on quantitative methods. As someone who was trained purely in quantitative methods, I haven't touched quant since I left academia. It's been, I think a lot of the really useful stuff is happening in the qual space. Or at least the novel stuff for me is qual.
I would like to ask a question about the fire ant example.
Mm-hmm.
Why that for you is a clear example of academia, because also looking partly at the definition that you gave, so integrating scientific or academic insights, because for me, although the methodology used, journey mapping or service design or whatever types of approaches they might be grounded within academia and also used, but for me this is still a very clear practice example. So what makes it not a practice but a pracademia example?
It's kind of both. So it is a practice example, but it's moving away from what I think has been the traditional practice in behavioral insights. So remembering that first example I gave was that very simple, we just apply ease to it, it's gonna be good, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
This is more about navigating complexity, focusing, well, I think it's all these, maybe this slide should have come earlier. For me, it's about, navigating that complexity using rigorous methodologies and working collaboratively to insert those directly into application. So we're partway through that project at the moment. The next stage is we're about to launch a survey to confirm some of those things. So there is a place for quant methods. I'm not saying there's not. And then we're going to take the insights from all that research activity up until that point, sit in a room with the fire ants people and come up with ideas. So that streamlining of academic rigor, novel techniques, inserting it into practice. I think that's why it's an example of that.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I'm asking this question. I used to work for also a university consultancy agency back in the Netherlands. It's called the Servant Science Factory. And what we were trying to do there is kind of commercialize the knowledge that was within the university, right? So also a kind of a vehicle to allow for access to all of the knowledge that we were generating in the university, and thereby possible also monetize it. It's different from maybe a government position where budgeting comes from. It's different in that sense. And what I found very interesting, because you journey map, you see like, okay, this is intended, but this is actually experience, and we see differences between the service provider and the customer, or at least the target audience. And then it could still also be very interesting to say, well, we see where there is overlap, we see where there are differences, to trying to use theory to further explain where does this now actually come from, and what is now the root cause of that. And I think that in your pracademia definition, you were referring to the complexity and the collaboration with multiple stakeholders, of whom potentially, maybe depending on the project, actual academics as a stakeholder. Because I think it's also from an purely academic point of view, it's very interesting to be part of such projects for the opportunity to have field data, right? Rather than lab data or hypothetical online scenario data. So I was wondering, to what extent, yes, I understand your starting point of addressing a societal problem, but I could imagine that there's some liberty to take and to think of value propositions to even with indeed the inclusion of academics, even get more out of such projects. So I was a little bit tapping into, okay, where is it now really academically grounded, besides the amount of stakeholders and the methodology and the rigor, which might be different from a pure practical approach.
So one thing I would point out, and I think we agree, one thing I would point out is there's no theory development in this example, but I think a pracademic approach would have theory development built into the approach, because that's the essence of the academic approach, right?
Because what I found very interesting, you just gave that example in terms of the refusers. This guy has a whole stack of guns and whatever, and that is a reason for him or her to not participate or to refuse. But it could also, I mean, it could really be behavioral, right? So you could say, well, indeed, I find it very interesting to try to find certain boundary conditions here, which might be personality traits that explain why someone has a tendency to either behave like this or like that.
Yeah. So, and kind of building on that, something we didn't consider up until a couple of weeks ago is there's probably a bunch of non-refusers who were at some stage considering refusing.
Yeah.
So what was it that brought them back on this side?
Yeah.
So that's something we're trying to capture with this next survey is, for people who,
So there's some degree of knowledge generation throughout the process, even though it's not explicitly set out from the start, for example.
Yeah, in this project, the theory is fly by the seat of your pants.
I think this is a really important slide. I think so. For me, it's a little bit, how much do you guys, as a behavior insight group, start internalizing in? Okay, so there's been another system thinking since the 50s, or the 50s. Thing. You can go back, sociologists, Luhmann, those are von Bertalanffy, economists, Kenneth Balding. How much are you going back to those sources to guide you in the way you structure the problem in that sense? Or if it's complex, what can we learn from Santa Fe Institute who thinks about complex systems for a long time? How much do you guys really train yourself to do that? Or also, I like this focus of individuals. When you come with a lot of experience about identity, group identity.
Yeah.
So how much are you able to bring that in this kind of environment? And there's a common language that people understand what you want to achieve. Go beyond this kind of individual focus, which is very, methodologically individualistic, that behavior economics sometimes is, still is, or the behavioralistic from a psychological perspective, and not cognitive psychological in that sense.
So two questions there, I think. One is about, how are we applying the systems thinking, and how are we making sure we're doing that in an academically rigorous way. We are not yet doing that. We would love to be working in this space. We are in some early discussions with some of the bigger departments in Queensland government who are in this kind of phase of designing their 5-year strategy or their roadmaps, those sorts of things. We are bringing this conversation up as something that would be useful for helping them frame that. And I've got a slide a little bit later that maybe goes into a bit more detail on that. And we will train ourselves up in that methodology if it goes ahead. So we're not systems specialists, but we have the resources available that we can get some training in that. And in terms of our thinking, how far back we go, not far at all. Maybe this is a surprise, but something that's come up on our radar quite recently is a combination of a behavioural science and systems thinking approach. This was something some colleagues back at BehaviourWorks were really driving a lot of, I think, in Australia, potentially internationally. But it sort of stems from the literature on transitions and wide system change. And so what they're doing is thinking about systems, but using behaviour as the touch point. So when you map out all the actors in a system, who do they influence? What behaviours are they influencing? And then doing a series of prioritization exercises to really take. So the advantage I see of a behavioural approach is it simplifies things and it makes it really concrete. But you lose so much of the complexity and the nuance. So if you pair that with that systems approach and you prioritize accordingly, I think you kind of get the best of both worlds. But I say that as someone who hasn't spent a lot of time working in that space. But that's something that's really exciting for us.
This is really insightful, and it's fantastic to see government do this. I should declare my biases. I worked 20 years for the Queensland government in the IT industry. That's what we do. So it's great to see this group within the government to do it. Now, working with agencies like I was the business development manager that put the emergency services systems in the Queensland Police Service. The new, so those sorts of organisations, those customer fronting organisations like police and health, think systems pretty much in their day-to-day, because it's how the work flows. And it was all about, response times and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
When we put the systems into Treasury, I was the guy who worked on the new financial management systems for Queensland Government with the Treasury pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And that was easy to implement across government because, of course, it was driven by accounting standards, right? So the process was already defined. You couldn't change it. But more recently, I've had the opportunity to deal with people like education. Now, so these are organisations that tend to operate in steel cylinders, and governments are notorious for this. Well, non-customer facing government agencies are notorious for this. The best example we have is the pink bats thing, and how you would get an environmental policy group to run an operational project is bizarre, right? And of course we all saw what happened from that with the feds. But I've had experience just recently with Queensland where we drew on academic evidence, piloted it in a school, and then when you go to the senior management in the agency, they're so change averse and so driven by equity that you can't. They ignore the field trial and basically they're doing some things in some of those agencies which counter what the other agencies are doing because they're not systems thinking. Right? How you educate people affects crime.
Yeah.
But if you do some other things, which I won't go into now, you actually amplify it. So
And I think
do you run into this?
Well, we haven't gone.
How do you overcome it?
We haven't gone down that far enough down our projects because we're still new that we're at that stage yet. But from talking to people, and it confirms exactly what you're saying. Is and I think it also speaks to this kind of black box thinking. Is if something looks good, that's sometimes good enough. But I made a comment earlier. Evaluation doesn't seem to happen as much as you might think. I think that's really important because of those unintended side effects. So evaluating, that's a good first step, but understanding why the change happened, not just that it happened, is I think a step further that we can go and avoid side effects like that.
One of the wonderful things that I experienced when we put the new financial systems into Treasury is the interdepartmental cooperation on that project. But of course, they all had a common thing. They all wanted to go to the Budget Review Committee to get money, and to get the report out, they had to use a common system. So it was kind of, the objective was to get money at the end of the day. The DD, the Director General, knew that he had to participate in this to get his budget, which is kind of a bit of a cynical reason, and didn't focus on the individual, did it, that sort of thing. It was once again focused on the black box at the end of the day. So any insights that you have on how to destroy the black box would be nice. With a steel cylinder.
Well, maybe I'll jump to an example that's not mine. We can come back to this if we like. So this is an example. This is from BehaviourWorks, and this is a project they've been doing for probably 5 years now. It's about maybe the kind of simple problem of circular consumption. So how do we reduce waste by reusing what we've got? Over 5 years, 10 reports, they worked to come up with this common vision across multiple different agencies and actors by kind of getting them all together in the same room and on the same page. That hasn't been easy, and I don't think that's a typical model for how government would work, how it ought to work maybe, but how it would happen in practice, probably not. But this is what I was talking about in terms of the behavioural systems mapping. So each one of those colours represents a different class of actor. There's government, there's producers, there's users of products, retailers, that sort of thing. And there's a link in the slides. I'm happy for those to be shared around afterwards. There's an interactive version of this, and you can go and see how they all relate to each other. But what they've got down the side here is priority behaviours, where they got everyone into the room and said, here are all the behaviours that are out there. How do we condense all of that into something that's usable? So prioritization to come up with those eight behaviours. Coming off that is how each behaviour is impacted directly by an actor in the system, but also how that actor's impact is impacted by other actors in the system. And so you start to build these sort of rich networks of how behaviours exist in complex systems. And this was something, to your point, this is something where they had, the Victorian State Department, so I forget what they're called, but, all the relevant agencies had teams that were working on this in the same room. So, and then there's a collective roadmap that has come out of that for a behavioural approach to the problem of to increasing circular consumption. Which kind of addresses your point, I think. But to me, it's that co-design with people who have knowledge and expertise, but also the ability to impact change.
And cooperate, which is what I see there.
And cooperate.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Well, if we've got 10 minutes left, there's some other slides. I'm a bit warm on them. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take those. Or we can. I've thrown myself under the bus here.
Get warm on the next slide. Do you want to go back to the slide with the 4 key points?
I would love to. Cool. So this is something that's been informing our thinking a bit. It's not new or novel, and it's something that you're probably more likely to see in, I think, kind of leadership buzz speak. But it's actually really helpful for us, and it's thinking about how we structure our work according to the complexity that we're dealing with. Complexity is something that I'm thinking a lot about at the moment. It's a Welsh word. This is the Conniving framework, and it classifies tasks or knowledge or problems according to different levels of complexity. So there's simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. The middle line of each of those boxes is a kind of approach that you would take to these things. But basically, with simple problems, we've seen these before, we know what works. We just need to categorize the problem into a solution and then apply that solution. And there's often a best practice associated with that. For complicated problems, we need to go out and collect data, understand the problem, collect data, and analyze it so that we know how to respond. We know it's a trickier problem, but it's been done before, or we have the expertise to figure it out. So this could be something like, the first one might be baking a cake. You just follow the instructions, the best practice, and you'll get a cake. Complicated might be sending a rocket to the moon. It's more complicated than making a cake, but we've done it before, we know how to do it, we've got the expertise, we can do it from scratch. Complex is where you're starting to get into, we haven't seen something like this before, we don't know what best practice is, and so we got to figure out what best practice ought to be. And so the example we kind of use here, this is very personally relevant, but raising a young child or having a baby is something that's complex. You can't tell someone the right thing to do because inevitably it doesn't work. It worked for them, but it doesn't work for you. And that kind of variability between experiences is actually really tricky to navigate. And then we've got things that are chaotic. So think your natural disasters, your COVIDs. We've just got to get out there, we've got to do something and then rapidly evaluate as to whether that's working or not so that we can start to make sense of the problem. Rather than collecting data on options and then choosing the best, we've just got to go with one and evaluate on the fly. I think I've kind of gone through these, but to maybe drive the point home a bit more, simple problems, it's predictable. We know that the relationship between cause and effect, and we've got solutions on hand that we can apply. I think this is a nudge situation. We know nudges work in these contexts. If we tweak these knobs, we'll see movement in the direction we anticipate. So complicated, the wider context situation is reliable, and previous experience is helpful in helping us form a response. That relationship between cause and effect is not necessarily obvious, but we can figure it out. Expert knowledge is useful, and there's multiple right options, or experts might disagree slightly, but there's something in there we can use. I think of the fire ants example as something that's complicated.
Infrastructure development.
Infrastructure development, yeah. Yeah,
Big one for government there.
there's probably multiple options and they've got their pros and
Yeah,
cons.
they can draw on previous experience, but they're not doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Again, so there is risk.
Yeah.
Tricky for government, that one.
Complex. All right, so it's happening now. The goal is confusing and maybe we don't even agree on what the goal actually is. That relationship between cause and effect, we might not actually be able to figure it out now. It's only after we've done something that we recognize that it was there. And this kind of rapid experimentation in terms of like data creation and iteration is really helpful for navigating those patterns.
Do you discuss there also what sort of methods do you need to use also in that sense? Because I mean, complex, for example, could be that you have a lot of factors that matter, and those factors have a big impact on the outcome. That's a different kind of method you need to use also empirically compared to like small factors that have a small impact, for example. So from an empirical point of view, it's completely different kind of empirical models or approach that you need to take to you. Is that a discussion that you in that sense?
In the example where there's lots of different factors,
Yeah.
I think it's such a simple thing, but I think it's overlooked so much. But I've said it a few times as well. Prioritization is such a powerful technique, I think. Getting people on the same page in terms of what's important, what we can reasonably implement or change, and then whittling that down to something our brains can manage from hundreds to a handful, I think is something I keep coming back to as a really important methodology, technique. I'm not sure.
That methodology would erase also, if the system itself, between components, there are actually feedback, and the effect of feedbacks is not small but subtle and quite complicated, and at the end it actually cascaded over the system as well, so that then prioritization actually you have a risk that even with that prioritization, the emergent outcome, might be completely different.
And so I think, I don't know if anyone in my position would ever say this out loud, but I think inherent in this kind of work is like a comfort with that. That if we go and try, we can only do what we can with what we've got, and the timeframes we've got is not a lot. So that kind of, particularly in that complex and chaotic, though I think that happens less often, but putting things out that are reasonably well informed as best as we can, and if that's academically informed, that's better than not. Then
because that speaks to so panel, such as maybe again, and you have that also there as well. Maybe from a methods point of view, agent-based modeling could be a way to for simulation that that informs a little bit better. That kind of project is.
I have a question because it's so interesting to hear it like from the government perspective, because you showed us some projects that you did from fire ants to the other one with the letter. So which departments do you work together with, or like what are your current projects where you say, look, that's a hands-on behavioral aspect that we have in the government and we need that. And like when is the time when you, for example, you call academics in, or you just rely on the fact that you have such a strong expertise as well in the team? So
the first question is how do we form partnerships with
Yeah, or like which
departments.
departments of the government you help, or who comes to you and say,
Yeah.
guys, we need your help, or like, yeah.
So
Because
it's
finance and the social housing so different. So I mean, it's both in the house though.
yeah. So we'll work with anyone basically. Where we're finding probably most like reciprocal interest is from smaller departments, because a lot of the bigger ones already have their own in-house capability. Department of Health has its own behavioural scientists. TMR's got a lot of people doing very similar stuff, although they might call it something else. Human-centred design is a big thing.
Police
over
and
that
government
way.
too.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Police and emergency services.
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
But those are also structured, in that sense, structured problems that you have this kind of knowledge. But for example, system thinking that has been forgotten for a while, reappearing. And there you would say, okay, can there be a joint force to say, okay, is it possible to organize a workshop in universities to get on top of those skill sets first?
Particularly in the complex and chaotic space, you would see that there would be multiple departments that would need to collaborate in order to really understand the current state, to then be able to navigate politically sound, policy sound, future state.
Yeah.
So like looking at youth justice as an example,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be able to just do that within your team. You'd need DJ, you'd need cops, you'd need all sorts of, probably need the whole government department really.
And there's a few things kind of on the radar that are whole of government like that, particularly for some of these very complex issues.
Yeah, complex, they are complex. Because you don't necessarily know what the end goal could look like, and everyone would have their own opinion of what great would look like.
Exactly.
Have the last word, mate. Otherwise, we're academics, we're going to keep talking.
Well, no, look, I'm happy to.
So who comes to you?
There's the last word is I thought it'd be handy just to throw up what I think useful skills for people who want to work in this practical context. I'll pause for pictures. So this is something that I've seen recently about doing behavioural science in practice. I would just make a slight change for a pracademic behavioural scientist in practice. I think some of the skills that are really helpful that I've found and surprised myself at how useful they are about how do you get information from a bunch of people in a room, and how do you work in large groups like that. So I'll leave it there. That's our inbox if you want to send any questions through. I think my personal email is in there somewhere as well, because I'm sure these will be shared. If you want to reach out, please do. But thank you for having me.
Morgan isn't just a great friend of Best and Bite, he's a friend of behavioural science, and like he said, he pops up everywhere. He was part of Nudgeathon this year. He's spoken at the Best conference. When he was at Behaviour Works, he was a colleague of the Best Centre. He's a great example of someone to befriend or to engage with, because he's always around in this behavioural space. So, some of the great questions you had around the practicalities of, how do governments engage with behavioural science and those sorts of things. Morgan's definitely someone to that you will see around, and please feel free to come up and harass him with your questions, because he's always so welcoming. Not harassing. But yeah, no, wonderful to have you. So thank you very much. And and if you have time, I think we're going to go for coffee now. So
Sounds good.
Absolutely. So more than welcome to join everybody. Thank you. And thanks everyone online for joining. Do we have any questions online? No, enjoy a coffee at home. Yeah.